My name's Brian Paterson. I'm assigned to patrol with the Junction City Police Department. And among my specialized duties, one of those is I'm also certified as a drug recognition expert, or a DRE. And what a DRE is an officer with a little bit further specialized training in DUI detection and enforcement. I believe it's slightly less than 1% of police officers nationwide are certified as DREs. So we tend to get sort of shared around. I do work not only for the Junction City Police Department, but for adjoining departments as well. We'll always kind of help each other out, and we get shared across jurisdictions. And primarily what the DRE's role is when someone has been arrested for DUI, they're brought to a police station or the jail, and they blow in the intoxilyzor. Typically, depending on what level of impairment the arresting officer saw out on the street, they're going to expect to get usually a fairly high number, and certainly in excess of 0.08 if they thought the person was impaired enough to be arrested. And what happens is sometimes the person will blow in the intoxilyzor, and a result of something significantly below 0.08 or even 0.00 might come back. And so then the question is, what accounts for this discrepancy? So the arresting officer will call a DRE, will respond. Sometimes it's from home, sometimes I'm on duty, I'll get called down to Lane County Jail or Springfield or Eugene. And what we do is we first talk with the arresting officer and try to get their observations on what type of impairment they saw and why they believe that person is more impaired than that intoxilyzor result is showing. Then what we do is we interview the person who's been arrested, and we have a prescribed 12-step protocol that we follow. One of the very first things that we determine in talking with them is, A, do we feel that the person is impaired right now at the time we're seeing them? And if so, is that due to a medical issue or some physical issue, and do they need medical attention? If not, is it from drugs? And if it's drugs, well then what kind of drug or drugs? And we don't actually try to identify the specific drug. What we do is we'll break it down into, we have 7 different categories of drugs. Alcohol belongs to the category of central nervous system depressants, but there's a lot of other ones as well. So sometimes people might have a medication, an antidepressant, which actually is a depressant, and they mix that with their alcohol, or there's illegal drugs, the most common that we encounter being marijuana, or there can be, meth or cocaine or a host of other things. And so we run them through a 12-step process where we actually give them another opportunity to do those 3 roadside tests that you have, probably most people are familiar with. The walk and turn, one leg stand, and the horizontal gaze, when you see the officer moving a pen or some other object back and forth, the person's watching. But we also check their clinicals. We look at their pulses several times, their blood pressure, look at their eyes and the way that they react to light. And from all that, we put it all together into and sort of compare it against a matrix that we have of signs and symptoms and which drug categories that might reflect. Based on that, we come up with an opinion about if the person is not impaired, or if they are impaired, what drug category or combination of categories we think would attribute to that, and or that would be attributed to. And the last thing we do is we get a urine sample for toxicology, and that really is more to kind of keep the DREs in check, because the results of that don't come in until well after we're done with that evaluation, and it's to confirm or refute the observations that we have of that person.
What is some of the training that a DRE has to go through to become certified?
The training is, well, first of all, an officer has to apply to the program. The program started actually in Southern California in the 1970s. In 1995, Oregon became the 24th state to participate. I believe all 50 states are now participating, as well as Canada, and it's in Europe, I believe it's just Germany and Sweden. And actually, among all those programs, Oregon actually has always ranked in the upper three, along with Washington and Arizona. So we run a pretty good program here. Ours is run by the state police, who administer all of it and run the training schools and the selection process. And the way an officer is selected is that he or she applies. They must be a full-time officer. They have to submit a little bit of a background on their DUI arrest record and their drug arrest record. You have to get an endorsement from a local prosecutor who's tried your cases before. And you have to get 2 endorsements from current DREs as well. If you're selected, then the school is a fairly intensive 72-hour school. So you're kind of usually off-site someplace for 2 weeks. And there's a lot of classroom as well as some practical testing of your abilities. The classroom portion's delivered by police officers, by emergency room doctors, ophthalmologists, a whole host of people. So you get a little bit of foundation and physiology about drugs and their effects on the various body systems. If you pass that school by a written examination, then later there's a field evaluation, which is typically held in the Portland area, and you're there for several days. And what they do is go out and find people who appear to likely be impaired from drugs, just out on the street. And these are volunteers. They come in and they're given a sandwich and a drink and so forth if they want to participate. And what they do is they come in and get evaluated by these students, and they may or may not be impaired. And because some of these people are living on the street and they may simply have other psychological issues or things going on as well. And so the DRE students will do full evaluations on them, which are verified by a urine toxicology, which is run overnight in that case and brought back. And each student has to do 12 observed evaluations, observed by an instructor with an 80% accuracy rate. After that, if you're signed off by all of the instructors who observed you, then you become certified as a DRE.
How long have you been certified?
I was first certified in 2010.
2010. Could you briefly describe a scenario where I'm going to say the wrong name, a DRE would be brought in? Say an officer brought somebody in and they blew zeros on the breathalyzer.
Mm-hmm.
So then the officer would bring somebody like yourself in to evaluate
What the impairment is?
What the impairment is, yeah.
So just sort of an example of that?
Yeah.
Well, sure. Say an officer might see someone driving in a way that doesn't appear normal. Maybe they're wandering out of their lane. They might be very slow to respond to traffic signals. You know, the light turns green and they're just sort of sitting there. They get stopped and the officer feels that the person is impaired. Maybe they were having trouble, just confusion, trouble presenting documents. They may show some physical signs like bloodshot, watery eyes, that type of thing. And there may or may not be an odor of alcohol present, but if the officer believes through his or her observations that more likely than not this person's impaired, they're usually going to have them do field sobriety tests. And if that person does very poorly on the tests, I mean, if they do fine, then they'll be sent on their way. If they do very poorly, then they'll likely be taken into custody and brought back to the station, where if it were, say, well, anything other than alcohol, the intoxilyzor is not going to register it. The only thing the intoxilyzor will tell you about is alcohol. So even if they had odor of alcohol, maybe they just truly had one beer earlier on and it's the odor's staying on them. But that's not what's impairing them at all, and so they blow zeros. And the thing is, before the officer calls a DRE, he or she has to be able to clearly articulate why the level of impairment that they observed in this driver was inconsistent with that 0-0. So you can't just say, oh, 0-0, maybe I made a bad call here and arrested the wrong person, which is pretty unusual. But you've got to be able to articulate to that DRE, like, here's why I called you. Right. It's not just they blew lower than I thought they might. Like, hey, they blew zeros, but I had to ask them for their license 4 times, and then they handed me a credit card, and I could see the license right there in their wallet. They passed over it, 2-3 times, kept forgetting what I was asking them to do, kept forgetting to do things, had trouble getting out of the car. And depending what type of drugs the person is on, the impairment might look very different. So in other words, somebody impaired from marijuana is going to look pretty different than someone who's impaired because of methamphetamine or cocaine. The meth person is going to be very jittery and very speeded up and very erratic, depending on what level of use they have, whereas a marijuana person might be sort of more the blank stares and sort of laughing and forgetting what they're doing, or a person who's taken too much depressant, like sleeping medication or something. They might actually appear to be drunk. They'll look like a drunk, but then there's just no odor of alcohol, and again, they blow 0-0, but all the signs and symptoms that officer sees are consistent with the normal signs of alcohol impairment. So those are all the things that we take into account as we do our evaluation. For instance, there are certain very visible symptoms that are only present with certain drug categories, such as the one where you see an officer, maybe you've seen on TV or you've seen them at roadside, where they're moving a pen or something back and forth and the person's watching with their eyes. We're checking for what's called horizontal gaze nystagmus, which is an involuntary jerking of the eyes as they pan. Well, not every drug's going to do that. Someone on meth, their eyes are going to move smoothly. It's just depressants, inhalants, or dissociative anesthetics like PCP or dextromethorphan that you find in cough syrup are going to cause those symptoms. So that's one data point for us. If we say, okay, yeah, this guy or gal's impaired, yet I didn't see any of that jerking, well, it's probably not from dissociative anesthetics, inhalants, or depressants. And so it's sort of a process of elimination like that. Or conversely, if you do see that, one of those categories is certainly going to be at play.
Now, you mentioned about categories of, there's certain categories that alcohol fits in, and, marijuana, and you mentioned antidepressants. How could somebody be impaired taking an antidepressant?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because a lot of people take antidepressants and they take them in a medically prescribed and safe way, and they can certainly be impaired from them if they take too much of them, or if they there's an additive effect if they take them along, say, with alcohol and then maybe some other pill that has a depressant characteristic about it. They're all going to stack up, and you might sort of get a perfect storm, and they end up being impaired when they didn't intend to. But with antidepressants, as I said, so many people are on them at a therapeutic level. That's the reason that we have a DRE do a full evaluation, and you don't just bring someone back and say, oh, gee, you blew zeros, give a urine sample, and whatever that shows, you're going to be charged with driving under the influence of. Because if you were on Prozac or some other antidepressant, it's not impairing you if you're taking it at the clinical doses or the prescribed therapeutic doses, but it is going to come back in that urine toxicology. And so when it comes back, they're going to be able to look at the DRE's report, and the DRE might say, no, this person wasn't impaired, or yeah, they were impaired, but the impairment was consistent with marijuana, not with a depressant. So the fact that you have Prozac come back in that toxicology isn't going to hurt you. In fact, the DRE is going to sort of be your best ally in that case, because he or she's going to say, no, the impairment had nothing to do with the antidepressant. So the process actually can kind of help to clear people as well.